Good evening, gents. Welcome to Man's Hour 9. We are returning to the topic of based historical moments because, there's just too damn many to go over with one stream. So I'm joined by a gentleman of power, Todd from Praise and Folly. How are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Doing great. We're going to have a great conversation about, more awesome moments in history that all guys should know.
Oh yeah.
So right off at the start, what's a historical moment you want to share with us, Todd?
Well, I think this is like the ultimate, pro move. So Plutarch records that when Alexander was marching to destroy the city of Thebes, the Greek cynic philosopher Diogenes was lying by the side of the road, and Alexander says, "What would you have me do for you?" And he says, "Get out of the way. You're blocking my sun." And then his bodyguard says, "Should I kill the man?" And Alexander says, "No, for if I were not Alexander the Great, there's no man that I would sooner be than Diogenes."
It's pretty based. Yeah, there's the whole conquest of Alexander across the entire world is just fascinating in and of itself. I mean, he leveled Thebes basically to the ground. If I remember correctly, because they was it they broke an alliance or they declare war? I forgot.
They rebelled. He was busy fighting troops, fighting tribes to the north in what is today Thrace, and
Hmm.
they revolted, and he burned them to the ground.
Yeah, well, he came, he saw, I conquered, but yeah, amazing. I remember in his conquest as well. One of my favorite stories from that was the siege of the city of Tyre, which was on like the Mediterranean at the time, and they basically couldn't get to the actual building. So over like a 9-month period, the troops just built their own bridge, one bucket of sand at a time, to get to the walls, which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Oh yeah, intense. Another really classic epic moment from Alexander is after the battle. I think at Issus, Darius offers him half the kingdom, some treasure, and one of his daughters in marriage. And one of Alexander's leading generals, a guy named Parmenio, says, "If I were Alexander, I would accept the offer." And he said, "I would too if I were Parmenio, but I'm not."
Mm, yeah, yeah, amazing, amazing points. He was, I don't know, it's so interesting, like thinking back on history, like how much of it is actually true and everything like that. But there was, I guess, like the story that people tell is that, the Persians were the ones that were behind the assassination of Philip II, and that's what like Alexander's rage basically was for conquering all of Persia. So that is interesting. He's like, nope, you guys took out my dad, so I'm going to conquer and destroy your entire nation and not stop.
Well, yeah, and then also the burning of Persepolis was in revenge for the burning of Athens 150 years earlier.
Amazing, amazing, and of course, at what age did he die? Was he 29 or was he 30 when he died? He was like
I
right
think
around
he
that
was like
age.
32, 33.
Yeah, so right about around that time. I mean, it's honestly just amazing, conquering pretty much the entire world at that time, naming God knows how many cities after himself, and then taking the Greeks to the far Indus, which no one had ever done before, and which is just amazing in and of itself. What's the big battle that they have? It was like a Hydaspes or something like that. I
Well,
forget.
which battle are you referring to, against the Persians or the Indians?
The Indians. It was
Yeah, Hydaspes.
mm,
Hydaspes. It was the elephants. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Amazing moments all throughout. Truly a man of power for sure.
Oh,
Um,
speaking of the Indians, there's another anecdote for Alexander you need to hear. The king Porus was captured by Alexander after the battle, and Alexander asks him, "How do you wish to be treated?" And he says, "As a king." And then Alexander makes him a satrap of his empire.
huh. Amazing. It really makes you wonder what the ancient world would have been had Alexander not died at such a young age, and then his empire just basically completely fell apart between like Seleucus and Ptolemy and all the other generals and such. So it's very interesting to see. But they did the Ptolemies were still in the reign in Egypt long into the Roman days. So at least they lasted for quite some time.
Yeah, yeah. The problem with the Macedonians, not just Alexander, was they had a difficulty maintaining continuity of government. They just
Mm,
constantly fell into civil wars and infightings. Egypt being one of the exceptions.
mm. Yeah, interesting. You mean to tell me it wasn't, we was Kangs that was in charge of, Egypt the
No,
entire time?
no.
Yeah, that's always, like, such a ridiculous, argument that you see on Twitter from, like, time to time. It makes you think, like, if the black man, was in charge of all these nations, how did he lose them all? I mean, it's
Yeah,
yeah, wild
yeah. It's
stuff.
just projection.
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course. All right, so we got fantastic Alexander the Great here, truly a man of power for sure, and even people, Caesar famously looked up to him greatly, in his own time. So, um,
Well, what's interesting, you mentioned Caesar. Well, Caesar was, I think this was before his commission to go invade the Gauls. He was in Spain, and he was under a statue of Alexander the Great, and wept at the foot of the statue. And his friends said, "Why are you weeping?" And he's like, "At my age, Alexander had already conquered the world."
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like that famous quote from Alan Rickman's character in Die Hard. He's like, and then the Alexander wept for there were no worlds left to conquer. Yeah, truly like an amazing thought process to have. You just uh, there's nothing left to do. I've done it all. What a thought that must have been. Uh, Crazy,
Hmm.
crazy. Um, well, one moment that I wanted to bring up was Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs in Mexico. In the early 1500s, like 1510 through 1512, basically was when it was. And it's truly amazing that, we were talking about before on air that, Hernan Cortez is often portrayed as just this bloodthirsty monster who was looking for nothing but gold and was willing to do anything to get it. But truly, this guy was a man of power in his own right. He deliberately disobeyed all the orders from the Spanish command in what is now Cuba, but they called like a Veracruz at the time. And he's just like, no, I'm going to assume my own command. I'm not going to come back and check in. I could take this empire. And he proceeded to, make native allies. Famously, he was welcomed into the city of Tenochtitlan as a god. That is amazing primary sources to read about. Just the Aztecs enthralled by these men coming on giant boats. They're riding horses, and there are accounts that the Aztecs thought that the horse and the rider were the same person. Like that they were gods. They have these new weaponry. They've got steel and 1,000 conquistadors with a couple hundred horses and guns, and a bunch of native allies took over the largest empire, in the hemisphere, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, he makes a lot of really bold moves. Some don't pay off, but so the at the time he's in Mexico, he's technically an outlaw because the governor of Cuba, Velasquez, did not give him leave to go on this expedition. So what he does is he's like, you know what? Screw this. I'm going to found the city of Veracruz, and my troops will elect me governor. So now I'm my own independent authority. And when Velasquez finally does get around to sending troops to Veracruz to arrest Cortez, he claims that this is already his own independent command. And that, by the way, guys, if you join me, you'll die rich because I'm going to go plunder the Mexicans. And that worked. They flipped sides. They didn't arrest Cortez after all.
Yeah, truly, amazing moment, and just goes to show, like it's not just military tactical knowledge that wins the day. You definitely need to have charisma, respect, and honor, and all these other qualities to gain the support of troops and such like that. So. Definitely certainly an intelligent man, and not just some bloodthirsty conqueror that is so often portrayed in the media and everything like that.
Yeah, no, of course he plays his hand a little too hard in Tenochtitlan, and when he's using Montezuma as a puppet, and eventually, depending on which account you read, Montezuma was killed by the Spanish or stoned by his own people,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
they get driven out of the city in the La Noche Triste. I think it was June 30th, 1520, and many Spanish drown in the lake. But learning from that, he realizes he needs to build his own war canoes and put cannons on them. So after that, he goes into the jungle, cuts down trees to make war canoes, and then cuts down logs to make rollers to roll the cannons in the boats along the land because they're too heavy to be pulled and there's no horses anymore.
Hmm.
So he then uses logs, and he just takes one from the back, puts it up front, and repeats as he moves these heavy objects to the lake. And then he has these canoes with cannons and gunmen on them, and the Aztecs are just toast.
Yeah, yeah, it must have been psychologically devastating for these natives to what must have been like a a thunderbolt coming out of this weapon in front of them. Even though like of course guns at the time, I think they were still using like arquebus and stuff like that, which took 15 minutes to reload basically. And like these crazy, and they weren't super accurate, and they were prone to failure and such like this. So I mean, it just yeah. The sheer numbers and it took to conquer these guys is absolutely crazy. And had a couple things gone differently, we might not have won. I forget the name of the there was the translator that basically translated. It was like a Tlaxcalan into Mayan and then Mayan to Spanish, I guess. And he just like happened to come across this translator. I forget the name. It was like some
Yeah,
ship,
yeah,
if I
yeah. It
remember.
was a Spaniard who had been shipwrecked a few years earlier. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah,
Lucky, fortunate moments like that. You can't plan for that.
yeah, yeah. Of course, but you just sometimes it requires a little bit of luck. And what was it that fortune favors the bold, so to speak. But yeah, they come back to the city with more men with these new kinds of tactics. And also, you got lucky that was it a smallpox outbreak that had occurred in the city at the time, and
Yeah, yeah. That was sort of the irony, right? The Aztecs bring the Spanish in because they think they're gods, but then that exposes this city of 250,000 people to smallpox.
mm, yeah, yeah, amazing. And then, of course, the city is completely burnt to the ground and leveled, and now Mexico City, the current capital of Mexico, now lies on its ruins, which is truly something. And there's some fantastic like old artwork and such that you could see of what the city like used to look like, because it was a city on the lake, the floating city with bridges leading onto it. So it must have been quite a marvelous sight to see.
Yeah, and of course the smallpox the Native Americans had never seen before. It must have felt like the wrath of the gods.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Which definitely I think kind of plays into the idea of them stoning Montezuma. Like the anger of the gods. That our leaders completely failed us. And wasn't it if I recall correctly, Cortez had had left the city and put a bunch of his like second in command in charge,
Yeah,
and they
it was the
basically
second command that was in charge. Yes.
yeah, yeah, and they got pretty ballsy with like the priests or something like that, and they slaughtered some priests, and then the people just had enough of them.
Yeah, and Cortez is like, wait, I didn't expect this to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Imagine like he just left his guys in charge. It was like you couldn't do one thing. He just they literally just let them into the city. The a quarter of a million people just let them in to conquer everything, and they just couldn't keep it together.
Well, they got too greedy too fast,
Mm,
and Cortez wanted to wait till the city was taken.
yeah, yeah. So very interesting, historical moment, and that was like at the peak of the Spanish Empire. I think it was something, if I remember correctly, the amount of gold that they looted at the time was equivalent to the United States Treasury in like 1960 or something like that. I forget what the exact number was, but they looted an astronomical amount of gold, and unfortunately, they did not, make their empire last, as it were. The Spanish burned brightly and then fell off, as it were.
Yeah, and then it was gone. A lot of that gold ultimately deflated the Spanish currencies. They didn't
Mm.
hold it in reserve.
No, well, fools. They should have read some economics. But funny stuff. And then shortly after this was the golden age of piracy, which is also something I wanted to bring up. You had these bands of privateers from England and Spain and everything. When after the English and the Spanish declared a ceasefire, all these privateers and sailors were basically out of the job, and they're not farmers, they're not blacksmiths, they're not merchants, they're soldiers, and there's no longer a war to fight. So what do? They decide to take their own ships and they start the golden age of piracy, just looting ships all across the Caribbean.
Well, also too, a lot of these were private contractors for governments with letters of marque. One
Mm,
of the most famous privateers, Francis Drake, when he was privateering, he's famous for, of course, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. But
mm.
I think it was 1582 when he was engaging in piracy. The Spanish captured his brothers and publicly executed them in front of his ship from their ship, and
Wow.
that just kind of gave him a revenge against the Spanish, and he just would just beat them down for the next 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it must have been such an interesting time because when you look at the the Caribbean, there's so many little outcroppings and islands you could easily go and hide on. I do remember this line, despite kind of like being cringe movies, but there's this line in Pirates of the Caribbean where one of the characters says like the world is shrinking, and it truly must have felt like that. Like you had this endless expanse of a sea and ocean with countless amounts of islands. It truly must have been like such a freeing time for these men on the high seas. And obviously, to quote our like BAP here, raiding pirate lords and everything like that. It really must have been something to see.
Well, and yeah, and the shrinking was the result of the nation states of France, Spain, and Britain crowding them out.
Yeah, very, very much so. You know, what else do you want to bring up here?
Well, there's just so many of one theme that I think is interesting is that you never assume that there's a piece of territory that you can't cross. Right, the most famous example is the Ardennes Forest, where the German Panzer divisions drove through in May of 1940. The French thought this can't possibly happen, and then their war was over in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it was the Maginot Line, I believe. Was that what it was called?
Well, that's what they were trying to outflank.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
The forest was considered the French thought the forest was impenetrable, so they didn't bother defending it.
Yeah, I always remember that was a very funny anecdote in the history books when you when you read it, like a far cry from the days of Napoleon for sure.
Well, and then of course the biggest Hail Mary move is Hannibal's march over the Alps. I mean that was some real ballsiness there. You lose half your army marching over the Alps, but then you get into Italy, and then the Romans are like, "What?"
Yeah, and he beats the Romans on multiple occasions. Of course, the big one is the Battle of Cannae, where he basically it pulls off a fantastic move. What is it? Like a double impalement or a pincer, basically. Like he has his front line back up, and then he has basically 3 sides of a box around the Roman troops. And if I remember correctly, isn't it the one day the highest amount of Roman casualties ever in Roman history?
I think so. Yeah, something like anywhere from 60 to 80,000 casualties.
It's honestly amazing. And if I remember correctly, the Romans had more troops too, but Hannibal just played it perfectly.
A lot more. They still had a lot more, but eventually they stopped giving Hannibal the bait he needed. Those battles.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, Hannibal is a fantastic character in and of itself. Just the absolute ballsiness of just a single goal of doing nothing but destroying Rome. He ends up losing an eye, throughout his battles and everything. And then, of course, when Carthage falls, he heads over to was it still the Seleucid Empire at the time? And he and he stays in the court of the current king. I forget his name at the time. Until the end of his days, basically. And then I think he commit suicide, like takes poison or something.
Yeah, the Romans are still after him, and he's just like, fine, I'll just not give the Romans the pleasure of taking me alive.
Yeah, very, very, very.
Also, speaking of epic moments, so before Hannibal does die, Scipio, who had defeated him 20 years earlier at Zama, meets him in Asia Minor, where he's working for the Seleucids, and they have one last heart-to-heart. And Scipio asks Hannibal, "Who's the greatest general?" Hannibal says, "Alexander, then Pyrrhus, then myself." And then Scipio says, "But what if you had beaten me at Zama?" He said, "Well, then I'd be the greatest general in history."
Yeah. Oh man, God, it really does speaks to something of and a part of masculinity and honor. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently about like a warrior culture and warrior honor and everything like that. It must have been such an amazing conversation. Just feel the energy in the room, like these two men who had fought on the opposite sides of a battle, but they still have such immense respect for each other. My mind goes to something similar, like with Caesar and God, what the hell is this guy's name? Who's the general that Ptolemy serves his head on a platter for him and he just weeps?
Pompey.
Pompey, yes, that's the name. And Caesar just weeps at seeing the decapitated head of one of his foes, and at one time an ally because they were part of the first triumvirate together. But yeah, it just seems so absurd today to think of maybe one of our generals meeting with like a Taliban leader or something like that. Like these guys just do not possess the same amount of gravitas or even respect for each other.
Right. Yeah. There's part of it is in antiquity, whether, the Greeks and the Romans especially, but even to a limited extent the Carthaginians, there was still this common culture of like a Mediterranean sea based or coastal based civilization, and they all worship the same gods just with different names, more or less. That's the whole point of Alexander going to the oasis in Egypt to be declared the son of Zeus or Amon Ra. Because they're just different names for the same gods.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very, very interesting. My mind also goes back to, even like even going back to, even like in Napoleon's day, there was still respect among generals. But then like you go to something like the Nuremberg, trials or something like that, and there's just absolutely no semblance of that whatsoever. And I wonder if it has something to do with more mechanized warfare, where like the individual general doesn't really have so much of a sway as somebody like Hannibal would. It seems like, and I've brought this up before on other streams. I feel like to bring that kind of sense of honor back into warriors in warfare. So you kind of need to bring back like those personal shields from Dune to try, like make the individual soldier more impactful again, because basically now we're just rocking around with drones and mechanized infantry and
here's a badass one. So in World War I, Patton and MacArthur were both in the same trench together, and since they were like trying to be peacocking, they were trying to like one up each other by standing straight in front of the incoming fire without flinching.
Yeah, I think I do remember this story. And then it was like the first time they met too, and then like they shook hands just in the middle of no man's land kind of deal. The goddamn, Patton would also famously when his troops were doing like live fire exercises, he would stand in between the targets downrange, and while his soldiers were firing downrange. So I mean, it's pretty ballsy.
Yeah, we don't want to shoot Patton, right? That's kind of the thing. Yeah, while Patton and MacArthur didn't lead from the front in the way that Napoleon or Alexander did, because you really couldn't in modern warfare, they were the kind of men that wanted to.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, for sure. I know I'm somebody who does not have kind words to say about MacArthur is actually Paul Fahrenheit. He's said many times that MacArthur is extremely overrated. I'd be interested to pick his brain more about that. I'm sure he's got his reasons and has probably read more up on it than myself, but still a very interesting character in his own right.
Yeah, I'm gonna stand by my Mac. Mac's pretty. He's not called the American Caesar for nothing.
Yeah, very interesting. Speaking of other American, commanders and such like that, I wanted to bring up, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, famously from the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, even though he was let's call it, let's be generous here and call it, the invading side, as it were, in the Southern War of Secession. It was very, very interesting how he held the line against, Robert E. Lee's troops that were trying to flank the Union Army at the Battle of Gettysburg. And famously, he leads this charge of his troops when they're out of ammo. They're sitting on top of Little Round Top. And he just orders his men to fix bayonets because they're out of ammunition and they know they can't repel another Confederate wave. And so he does a right wheel, charge of his men to, again, much similar to, what we were talking about earlier with Hannibal getting around the Romans. He does the same thing, but this time running down the hill, and his men just, wheel around, get on the side of the Confederates, and save the whole flank from the whole battle.
One time, I think this was in the Battle of the Wilderness, Ulysses Grant was doing some of his own reconnoitering and went up to a soldier in a blue coat whom he thought was a Union soldier who was having a smoke. And it turns out that it was a Confederate soldier because the uniforms weren't standardized yet. And as soon as he realized it, he just walked away and the Confederate soldier wasn't the wiser.
Amazing. I didn't know that. Yeah, that does bring up an interesting point though about like a uniforms not being uniform, because famously Stonewall Jackson was killed by his own troops. So
right.
Very, very interesting. To bring up the last bit of story about Chamberlain himself. So he goes on to fight in the rest of the war, and eventually he gets gut shot in a future battle. I forget which one. And he's basically promoted to, I think he's a brigadier general. He's promoted on his deathbed. He was expected to die, but amazingly he pulled through, and he went to become the governor of Maine there afterwards. And the guy lived to a ripe old age in his 90s and is often regarded as the last casualty of the Civil War. No, so very interesting guy to read about.
It's also interesting that the American enemy in the Mexican-American War, Santa Anna, died in the United States, exiled from his own country.
Really, I did not know that. I know, during the Battle of the Alamo, famously, and I mentioned this on the last stream I did on this topic. Davy Crockett, famously, the legend goes is that when he was out of ammunition, he was taken prisoner along with Jim Bowie and a couple other guys. And rather than surrender, he tried to attack General de Santa Anna with his bare hands, and he was shot in the exchange. So that's very interesting. I didn't know that about. I didn't know that about him.
Well, after losing the war, the Mexicans didn't really want to have him around anymore.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
So, yeah, a lot of these like frontier people got up to some. It's hard to believe some of the stuff they got up to.
Yeah, yeah, really. It's so difficult for us to conceptualize this. And I saw this going around on Twitter today. Actually, people were talking about Antarctica. As like the next frontier. And it's very interesting because back to our conversation about how the world is shrinking. It just seems that it's just so far away, these tales that we hear about the frontier or the open seas, or in the antiquity period in the ancient Mediterranean, where there was still like some bits of adventure out there. And I think that's innate in every man. Something deep inside him is just telling him to go out and explore, go out and conquer, to do something.
Yeah, yeah. So it's that lack of a frontier. And so, like for the U.S. context, 1890 is sort of the closing of the American frontier. I guess because the Southwest on the border with Mexico is generally lawless. There's a still quasi frontier element to it. So that's where like Patton cuts his teeth on the raid against Pancho Villa.
Mhm.
But yeah, generally it's closed. There aren't any more of those things.
Yeah, yeah, it's I mean, I guess that comes up to the discussion where, the Faustian man was going to go next. And for the longest time, it looked like he was going to reach out towards the stars. But, in the last 60 years, we really have done jack shit on that front. So I don't know, maybe Elon can, give us a new land to conquer. But yeah, we're going to have to look for something, look for bits of adventure somewhere.
Sadly, that drive is being sublimated into cyberspace, where it's ultimately being wasted.
Yeah, yeah, very good point. Absolutely. Sedation is a great way of putting it. But yeah, it brings up interesting ideas. I always love that. One of BAP's like biggest talking points is just like I know he points this out in his podcast on many occasions. He just points out to different parts of the world where there's still is ripe for conquest. I remember my mind goes back to his podcast about like Mad Mike Hoare and his conquest of like Central Africa, and it's like wow.
And a lot of failed coups.
Yeah.
Well, something I wanted to bring up earlier when you were talking about Cortez and the Mexicans or the Aztecs. This was there was an empire in further to the west in Mexico that the Aztecs were fighting on a pretty regular basis, but not gaining the upper hand because this tribe had copper. One of the few Native American tribes that had metal weapons. They were the Perupachas. And what was interesting is there's accounts where they had like these fortified positions opposite the Aztecs with like, towers and flame signals. And then they just saw all the Aztec troops just march away and all the flame signals go out. And they're like, what the heck is going on? And that was happening as they were redirecting troops to fight Cortez.
Interesting.
So, like, you just imagine like you're on the front for like, years and years, and then all of a sudden they just leave.
Wow. Huh. That's
gone, never to come back.
Amazing. I had actually I had not heard that account. That's crazy. Another thing about the the Aztecs, their weapons they also used were obsidian, like the black volcanic gas or glass, sorry. Extremely sharp, and their weapons like macuitos, which are basically just clubs with the shavings of the obsidian built into the actual club face. And I forget the name of the guy who was the primary source. One of the Spanish conquistadors wrote a book about the conquest. I forget his name at the moment, but there's an account of one of the Aztec guys beheading a horse in one strike with one of these weapons, which maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't, but just thinking about that is pretty astonishing.
Yeah, those basically like club swords, whatever you want to
Yeah.
call them. They were brutal. Like without armor, they were just gonna tear you to pieces.
Yeah, yeah. Thank goodness that the Spanish had, steel breastplates and stuff like that, and steel helmets and everything. Otherwise, I'm sure things would have been much different. Because I knew the Aztecs at the time were just wearing like cotton armor, because they
Mhm.
didn't have metallurgy to that skill, But yeah, it must have been very, very amazing to see like this, Mesoamerican architecture to such an extent that was so different from the old world and everything like that. And there really just is nothing like that left. I mean, I guess like the closest you're going to get is something like Machu Picchu, but that's kind of eroded away as well too. It's interesting to think about what was lost.
Yeah, what gave the Spanish, obviously the technology gave them an upper hand, but I think the real upper hand was mental space.
Mm,
The Aztecs fought wars to capture slaves, to offer a sacrifice to the gods. And so the war clubs, while they could cut your head off, they'd often knock warriors out with the flat side to then
mm,
capture them and then sacrifice them. So the Spanish were not fighting for captives. They weren't fighting. They were fighting to win. They were fighting to conquer another civilization. And so you have these like two vastly different mental spaces. And I think that gave the Spanish the real advantage.
mm.
This mental space, because the Aztecs would never push their advantage. And that's in part because they were fighting for what they thought were different goals.
Mm, yeah, very interesting. I guess you could say we have modern examples of that as well. In our own struggles about the left versus right. The side that wants to win. So very, very interesting. All right. What else? What other historical moments do you want to bring up here?
Well, yeah, so we've spent a lot of time with like in, antiquity and stuff from there. One of this is, I guess, maybe not badass, but I still think it's based. King Alfred of the Saxons, when he was on the run from Vikings, according to legend, was hiding in the fens and marshes of that part of England, East Anglia and the Midlands. And what he did was he met this like woman in a hut baking bread, and she says, watch the bread for me while I go gather some wood for the fire. And he's thinking about the kingdom being attacked by Vikings, and he forgets about it and lets the loaves of bread burn. And she gets back, not knowing who he is, and starts chewing him out. And when her husband gets home, he's like, "Don't you know that's the king?" But he still takes it in stride, and you know that's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. Definitely a far cry from elites of today, for sure. Just to humble yourself in such a way. Very interesting.
Another one was the Archduke. The reason why the Archduke was shot actually and killed is the first attempt to kill him, leading up to World War I, failed and shot one of his companions. So he goes to the hospital to check on him, but he goes through some back rows, and there's a second chance where the assassin kills him.
Yeah, yeah, I remember reading that yeah, the first attempt failed, and then Gavrilo Princip is just walking down the street and just sees him. He's like, okay, I'm just gonna pull out my gun and shoot him here because the bomb didn't work on the first one. So yeah, yeah, that is. We were mentioning before about like luck throughout history, and that's certainly one lucky moment, one might say.
Those turning of the tide, yeah.
Mm,
And it's interesting too that what I think makes Alfred interesting in another way is that in the Western Europe, the Vikings were pretty much invincible for a long time, but Alfred was their first major setback.
mm. Yeah, yeah. His kingdom was never conquered, right? He was like the last holdout.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting stuff. Um, let's see. Well, speaking of based like elites and everything like that, my mind went to Teddy Roosevelt. One of my favorite guys throughout history, even though he's a pretty bad politician on certain things that came through with us today, like in the progressive era. But famously, it's funny because he became president because the president before him, McKinley, got shot, and that's how he became president. And then, funnily enough, when he was giving a speech, there was an assassination attempt on him as well, and the shooter got a shot off and hit him in the chest. And he proceeded to give the rest of his speech, and then he ended the speech by addressing the audience, saying, "Well, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I've been shot, so I'm going to go take care of this, which just an absolute badass moment for sure.
Well, also, while Carnegie was away in Scotland, his agent, a guy named Frick, there was an attempted assassination on his life by an anarchist, and so the anarchist like walks into his office and shoots him, but I think he slightly misses the mark and just gives him a flesh wound. So he runs out of his office and starts beating the crap out of him in the hallway, and everybody in the hotel has to like pull him off this assassin. So,
Truly amazing. We again like you think back to like the elites of old, like these just great men, and you don't make them anymore. And then who are like our elite top tier men now? They're all, Jeff Bezos with enough money that he could easily like conquer entire countries and build himself a dynasty that would last hundreds of years. And instead, he wastes his time getting divorced and sleeping with not attractive women and trying to court celebrities. It's so bizarre to me. They just how far the elites have fallen. It truly is binary Leninism.
one of the things that sort of ties in exploration with the Vikings is when you read the Icelandic sagas, but specifically the Vinland sagas, where they make it to North America. It's just so strange reading about medieval Europeans going to North America and then trying to make sense of what they found.
Mm,
It's
yeah,
almost like the Vinland sagas, along with Conquest of Mexico by Cortez, almost feel like first contact with an alien race.
yeah, really. It had let's imagine it this way. I mean, this is essentially how like subspecies get formed. Essentially, when you have like extreme isolation for such a long period of time, it would be really, really interesting to see. For let's just imagine like the Atlantic was, 3 times larger or something. It was much more difficult to cross. How much later into history would these two sides have, contacted each other, and had they even remained isolated to this day, what would things look like? How would things have been different? So, yeah, it truly would be like looking into an alien world.
Yeah, and as far as like, there are still certain tribes that have largely remained resilient to modernization, like the Andaman Islanders in the Indian Ocean, and
Mm.
also certain tribes in the Amazon.
Yeah, yep. I know the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Brazil is, this is still like a really, really big issue in Brazilian politics, interestingly enough. It's like, well, what do we do with these, hundreds of, undocumented tribes basically that are living in the deep jungle and everything like that that are still completely in the Stone Age. It's really fascinating to think about.
I think one reason why there's still so many Indians in Brazil is because they're isolated by the jungle and diseases don't reach them as easily like they did in North America or Mexico.
Mm, yeah, very much so. Like it's jungle is some of the most difficult terrain to make your way through. It's not just like the open deciduous forests or the Great Plains of America. Like the jungle has a million different ways to kill you. It's really difficult to live in. It rains nonstop. So it would be yeah, much more difficult to get into contact with these people.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of funny. One of the well, it's not really funny. It's just ironic because it ended badly for the Vikings. They gave the Native Americans milk as like a peace offering, but they were lactose intolerant and thought they were being poisoned.
Oh wow, really?
And so they turned on the Vikings, and that was the beginning of some of their bad blood.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I've not read much of the like Vinland accounts of Vikings in the Americas, so that would be really interesting to read up more about because I do not know too much about them.
Yeah, I mean, because if you think about it, they're not the same Vikings, but they sailed from as far away as north, to the Americas, as far west, and as far to the east as like the Arab world. Like that's a huge reach.
Yeah, yeah, truly amazing people, to do that, and they're kicking around these and like the at what point did they get there? Like 1100s, or was that too late, or like a 1000, or what was the total?
1000 was right around the time when they got to the New World for the first time.
Mm. Wow, amazing, amazing. It took Columbus almost 500 years later to really get there with any degree of force. So, fascinating to read about.
And then, of course, the Europeans forgot about it. They
Yeah.
thought, for many years, people thought the Vinland sagas were just myth.
Yeah.
But we found Viking settlement remains in Canada.
Yeah, amazing. Truly amazing. Different kinds of people for sure. And then I think I remember this was discussed on a BAP podcast as well. They were addressing the theory about like Polynesian and Pacific Islanders just island hopping their entire way across the not the Atlantic but the Pacific, and getting into what is now like Peru and Chile and stuff like that. And arguments are made that that is where like the genetic stock of people is, because the long running theory was natives came down from Siberia, and the Inuits and stuff like that during the Bering land bridge during the last ice age. And these guys are arguing that no, their genetics are actually traced back from Pacific Islanders. So these guys with just small little dinghies, not even like long ships, like the Vikings did, but they just island hopped their entire way across, which is honestly astounding.
Well, they used well, that theory was tested by Thor Heyerdahl with the ship Kon-Tiki, and he made the trip
Hmm.
from
Amazing.
like Micronesia to somewhere in South America, and it was a catamaran raft. So they had like two canoes that were like with a raft on top of it to create a catamaran with a sail.
Hmm. Uh, amazing. Like it almost just makes me depressed hearing all these like amazing stories of a history of people like conquering insurmountable odds, whether it's enemy troops or the elements or just Earth itself, basically to conquer and make it your own. And then again, we look to today, and the biggest problem that people have, is what, like getting to their 9 to 5 job. It's so depressing when you view it in that lens.
Well, yeah. I mean, in part, the reason why there's no more room for discovery or exploration is because mach- a lot of that work was risky, but had to be done, and it had to be done by men because obviously women and children can't do it. But we have machines that quote do it for us, unquote, and so it sort of just takes all of it out.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Modern man is just so sedated in almost all aspects of everything, to the point now where everyone is worried about obesity as opposed to starving to death, which is just a completely unheard of problem to have throughout all of history.
Yeah, well, it is, and now you mentioned the possible Micronesian Polynesian origin of South American stock. Are you familiar with the Solutrean hypothesis?
No, no, maybe if you explain it, but not by
So,
full
so
name.
basically, it's the idea that during the last ice age, based on similarities of stone arrowheads found from a strata in southern France called Solutria and places in the eastern United States, some archaeologists have hypothesized that Europeans over the last ice age had gone over into North America before what we would call Clovis man, who was the Native Americans that we see today, by about 4 to 5 thousand years, and that they were defeated at some point in the past by Clovis man and driven to extinction.
Hmm, interesting. It could entirely be possible that there were multiple different kinds of
Settlement.
hominids and stuff like that. I mean, I know there's accounts of Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals and Homo sapiens all duking it out and fighting each other in Europe and Russia and such. So it could entirely be possible. I have to look more into this, but yeah, it really does. The mind boggles to think about some of these things. I was thinking more about recently, just about how much of history is actually, the way people tell it. I mean, you just look at the way news and history is gathered today, and you see how so much of it is just blatantly fake and just, written by those in charge. So, what's to say that our history of old is much different?
So I think that there's a significant reason why it's different now as in the past. So first of all, there were always, what we might call the court historians that would flatter Pharaoh, flatter the Caesars, flatter the emperor. Those people are always going to be around centers of power, and they act a lot like the people we see today on CNN or MSNBC or BBC or whatever. But I think there's two crucial differences that make ancient history more trustworthy. One, a lot of these things, whether they're reporting on battles or exploration or hidden secrets like paths or resources, I mean, this was life and death. Like if you got this wrong, your whole tribe was going to die. Like
Mm,
you know, and so if you're writing it down for your tribe in the future or for some other reader to figure out, if you don't do that, then you're all going to die. Whereas right now, overtly lying again and again and again doesn't have much of a cost right now. I think it will have a cost in the future, but currently we can sort of offload that cost. And then, second of all, in antiquity, people were interested, they were actually interested in finding the truth. It wasn't just, truth is useful, it's a useful smokescreen for the status quo, but it's something that we're actually trying to find. And
mm.
in part because it's a matter of life and death. I mean, if you don't find the truth, you starve to death, right? If the guy was wrong about which fork to turn in the road and you end up in a desert instead of a fertile valley, you're dead.
Mm, yeah, very interesting argument. Yeah, I could definitely see that being the case. And then I guess as well comes the question of, how much of history was just blatantly lost. I mean, of course, the classic example is the burning of the library at Alexandria. Like how much history was lost in those tomes and those texts, or maybe even an example like we gave earlier. I mean, how much of Aztec history was completely lost to us because of the sacking of Tenochtitlan. So,
Oh yeah, there's plenty of that. Um, the other thing that's interesting, we've been, I think, probably because of your reading of BAP's work, you're interested in explorers and these wide-ranging things. We mentioned the Vikings and we mentioned the Cortez.
yeah, I just can't help it. It's always just been a part of my psyche since I was a small kid. So,
Well, there's another one that's really interesting too that a lot of people tend to forget is we okay officially, right, Africa was like first circumnavigated by like the Portuguese,
hmm.
but according to ancient Greek accounts, the Phoenicians actually circumnavigated Africa. Now, okay, the Portuguese, of course, had ships of sail, so these are big vessels that could sail with the wind around the world. Eventually demonstrated by
Henry the Navigator.
yeah,
Yeah.
but what's interesting is they're only having like galleys. So just imagine like galleys. And there's a text called the Peripolis where they sail from Morocco. It's an incomplete text, but they make it all the way to like almost the Congo.
Hmm.
And then there's another account by Herodotus, which says that the Egyptian king Necho hired Phoenicians to sail from the Red Sea all the way around to the Mediterranean. And they claim to have done it. And it's funny, Herodotus didn't believe him, but he said that their testimony indicated the sun shifted its position as they rounded the Cape. And since we've already done that, we know that the Phoenicians were correct, which the only way they could have known that is if they'd actually sailed around Africa.
Hmm.
So we're talking around like 500 BC, guys in galleys sailed around Africa.
Yeah, that's amazing to think about for sure. I mean, it's really easy to for us sitting in the 21st century here to view back in time. I think this is such a big problem, like the progressive lens of history that we've all been fed since we were kids, that people in the ancient world were just complete buffoons and just barely knew anything compared to those of us that live today, when probably in all actuality they probably had a better grasp of what it means to be a human and actual better grasp of the world that we live in than we do now.
Oh, absolutely, because they had to navigate a world that was actively trying to kill them
Mm,
with, wild animals, famine, the weather, the sea. I mean, you had to see the difference between then and now is you had to sort of to use a fighting analogy, roll with the punches because nature was stronger than you. You had to
mm,
figure out how to basically surf it. Whereas because we have machines, we believe that we're stronger than nature and can sort of ignore it.
mm, yeah, yeah,
And so it creates a lot of these moral hazards. I mean,
yeah.
if you're in a wooden ship trying to sail around Africa or sail to North America, you have to pay attention to the weather.
Yeah, very much so. Hubris of modern man has us so detached from everything. One last based moment I want to bring up here is our classic Genghis Khan. Conquering his entire way across the great grass ocean of the steppe plains and Asia and just conquers his entire way into Central Europe, and it leaves such a mark upon history that even to this day, it's something like 1 in 150 people in Asia are direct descendants of Genghis Khan, which is truly spectacular when you think about it.
Yeah, well, and of course, Genghis Khan is sort of the culmination of that nomadic culture for millennia, perfecting that art form of war. And yeah, it was pretty much invincible for 100 years.
Yeah, and if I remember from my time reading up on this subject, one of the things that made their fighting force so strong and powerful was that they had stirrups, which Europeans did not have on their horses, so it made them much easier to stabilize their horses. And crucially, horse archers, they were much easier to flee away from the enemy. And if you're on a stirrup, you can stand up on top of your horse and aim your bow in many different directions. So it was a huge advantage for them.
Yeah, repeated, training as well, because the problem we see on the DR right now is the same problem medieval Europe had. Too many independent-minded knights not knowing how to keep in their lane.
Them's fighting words, Todd.
Hey, it's true.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny. Yeah, good stuff. And then also like and of course as the Mongols made their way across, they adapted new tactics from the people they conquered. I mean, famously their cavalry sabers changed designs as they went through the Turks, or maybe it was the Persians. I forget who was like officially the people in charge at the time, but they modified their sabers to new technology. They would modify their arrowheads of people they conquered. So they were certainly very efficient. And they also were like kind of like the front runners of the modern day, Pony Express that was tried again in America. I forget exactly how many stations between, their empire. They had an outpost with a fresh horse for the new rider. I'd have to look that up again and see what it was. But yeah, very, very, very interesting.
Well, the Persians had something like that too, from Sardis to uh, their capital, Persepolis, where they would send mounted messengers to and from the empire.
Hmm. Yeah, no, very interesting. I mean, you had to make do with what you had in that time, and they certainly innovated very creative ways for sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. What else you got for us? You got any other based moments to share with us, as it were?
One of the ways the Romans used to send messages in secret, so that even if they were captured, the enemy wouldn't know how to read it, is they would have a strip. Well, I guess it wouldn't be paper. It would be like maybe animal skin or papyrus, where they would wrap it around like this dowel that was only made for them, that it was kind of like a trade secret. They'd write the message out, then they'd unwrap it, and then they would send it with a messenger to somebody else. And if they got captured, since that dowel wasn't available to any other empire, they couldn't read it. But
Hmm.
once you got it to the other Roman, he could then wrap it around and read the message.
Hmm. Wow. Very interesting. God, they were very, very crafty and intelligent people for sure. Many amazing stories, to say the least. There definitely are accounts of the Greeks and the Romans having the concept of steam and steam engines. They just weren't able to actually pull it off, but they had the ideas. So give it a little bit more time. That would have been really really cool to see what they could have
I
come up
think
with.
probably for if you're going for badass points, there's two examples. One by the Maccabees, and then one by a Celtic captured by Hannibal, where they killed an elephant singly.
Amazing, amazing.
With the Jewish warrior, the elephant fell on top of him and killed him. And in the case with Hannibal, Hannibal didn't want anybody else to realize that elephants could get killed, so he killed the guy, so the secret didn't get out.
Amazing. Yeah, that is a interesting idea though, because it's such like a familiar animal to us, but it must have been absolutely devastating for the Romans who had early, heard of these beasts, in stories, or maybe like some piece of pottery somewhere at some point. But yeah, that it really is interesting to think about something so mundane and easy as something you see at your local zoo is just this absolute towering monster, that God knows what it must have been like to first see one on the battlefield with sharp tusks and trampling over and running over people and archers on the top. Yeah, really interesting thing to think about.
The Romans initially thought they were giant cows.
Amazing. Huh. Okay. Very, very interesting stuff. Hmm. Well, you got anything else you want to share with us? Well, we got 5 minutes left or so.
Well, yeah, sure. The other thing you want to watch out for is not just elephants. You want to watch out for ballistas. Um, there's two classic examples where a guy basically got run right through by a 3-foot arrow fired from one of these machines.
Mm.
Alexander crossing into what is today Uzbekistan and Afghanistan at the Jaxartes River. He covered his crossing with these catapults, and one of the princes of the Scythians who had all his armor and was on his horse just gets shot right off the horse, just run right through with like this huge arrow, and then which broke the morale of the troops, and many of them fled. And then about 800 years later, when the Romans are fighting the Goths in Italy, and Belisarius is holding the city of Rome, a Gothic warrior champion is taunting the walls, and they shoot one of these things at him and pin him to a tree.
Amazing, amazing. That's an interesting topic to bring up in and of itself. The like invention of like I guess you could call ballistas like early artillery and stuff like that. I mean, my mind goes to like the siege at Constantinople when was it Mehmed that was it the second who was the invader? Yeah, and just bombarded the city for what was it like 63 days or something like that nonstop and broke through the the outer walls of Constantinople to go through. It's that must have been psychologically devastating, just seeing your wall be eroded inch by inch and just hearing these loud noises of artillery shells busting into your walls day after day, day after day.
Well, let's not forget Greek fire. Can you imagine going up against fire that burns on the water?
Yeah, oof, yeah. the world used to be such a really, really cool place, but also such a really terrifying place at the same time. That really is something. I mean, just to think about the just conquest of like the native lands in and of itself. The wilds just used to be so dangerous. I mean, my mind goes to the various species of megafauna that used to exist, throughout the ages of antiquity. Like there are way more lions and bears of much larger sizes that exist now that used to exist in these places, and of course they were all hunted to extinction. So it's very, very interesting to think about.
Well, yeah, and also going back to the Aztecs, right? A lot of their warrior castes were inspired by these predators, right? The jaguar warrior, the eagle warrior. A lot of Native American religious practice believed that you could sort of like take on the spirit of this strong predator animal.
Yeah, very much so. I know a lot of the jaguar warriors actually had to go out and get their own pelt itself from a jaguar and wear it on their uniforms. So yeah, definitely interesting. I was actually telling a story to one of my buddies IRL not too long ago. But so I spent some time in Tanzania and Kenya on hunting safaris, and the Maasai people that live right on the border between Kenya and Tanzania. They're young boys. In order to be initiated and accepted as men in their tribes, they have to go out and they have to kill a lion by themselves. And the catch is that when they go and kill this lion, they're only armed with a spear. They're butt ass naked, and they are not allowed to get a single drop of blood on them. And if they get a single drop of blood on them in this process, they fail the challenge. So you have to go and kill a lion with a spear. And if there's any blood on you when they come back and find you and they inspect you, you're screwed. And again, this is like African scrubland brush where all the trees are covered in massive ass thorns that are inches long. So these guys will train by stepping on like all these thorns to callus up their feet, kind of like hobbits, to ensure they don't get any blood on their feet. Which they certainly don't make them like that now, do they?
No, not anymore.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a pretty based hour, I must say. We covered a lot of cool historical moments for sure. Anything you want to plug, man?
Well, yeah, just go to my YouTube channel, Praise the Folly Podcast. Don't forget to also check out my locals, or you can subscribe and support to the channel there. And again, this is a relatively new thing that I've been doing, but Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I have regularly scheduled programming. Monday and Tuesday are going to be my casual streams. Wednesday, I'm going through church history with Logos. And then on Thursday, I'm doing fantasy, but more directly, the decisive battles of Middle-earth.
Yeah, that Middle Earth series would be really interesting to see. And then I also really liked your casual stream you did earlier this week about issues around like sexual revolution and energy consumption and such like that. I thought that was very insightful.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Cool. Last thing I will I'll just show my appearance, my most recent one that I did with Dave, the distributist, on Tuesday. I thought he and I had a fantastic conversation. So if you guys hadn't listened to that, go and check that out. Dave's a pretty good guy, and we got to the meat of a lot of issues between the Manosphere versus Tricon. So be on the lookout for that. And as always, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to my Substack, and follow me on Twitter. And on that note, be well, guys, and we'll see you next time.